Welcome you all to the Eatonville Library. My name is Sarah Brown, and I am the manager of this amazing library in this amazing town. I welcome you today for our event, Journey Towards Freedom. This is a collaboration between the town of Eatonville, Esteemed Learning, 1887, and of course the Orange County Library System with the best library in the system, the Eatonville branch. So welcome you all to this event. I'm getting ready to after I welcome you in to introduce you to my co-host today, who's going to be helping host today's event. Her name is Ruth Critton. She is full of knowledge of the history and the culture and the heritage of the town in Eatonville because she is a fifth generation descendant of Joseph Clark, who you all know was a freed slave who stepped out on faith and started the town of Eatonville. So Ruth is going to come and not only introduce our speakers for today, but she's also going to be reacquainted and welcome her family here with us. They're here virtual, so these are all relatives of Ruthie, and a lot of you here in the audience are also relatives of our presenters today. So without further ado, I introduce to you Ruthie Critton, and she's going to introduce our speakers for today, who just happen to be her cousins.
I guess we have an additional co-host today, Mr. Esaias himself, another sixth-generation descendant of Mr. Joe Clark. Again, greetings, everybody. Welcome in. I am Ruth, happy and proud Eatonville resident. I'm here in collaboration with 1887 Juneteenth, celebrating the holiday today. I do have a bunch of family in the building, so I know Uncle Joe is happy right now. A bunch of family on the screen. I am happy about that right now. And I guess I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker this afternoon. We have Dr. Christy S. Coleman, a tireless advocate for the power of museums and narrative correction. She's an innovator in the museum field, having held leadership roles at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Wright Museum of African American History, and the American Civil War Museum. She now serves as the executive director of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. Ms. Coleman is the recipient of numerous awards for her decades of impact, including 3 honorary doctorates, nice and fancy, yes. In 2018, Times Magazine named her one of 31 people changing the South, and in 2019, Worth Magazine named her one of 29 women changing the world. In 2023, she received the David McCullough Prize for Excellence in American Public History. She's also an accomplished public speaker, screenwriter, and has appeared in award-winning documentaries, including Grant, Abraham Lincoln, Black Patriots, Civil War Heroes, Neutral Ground, and When the Monuments Came Down. She's a historical consultant for film and television, and most recently, she's worked on the award-winning film Harriet, Showtime's miniseries Good Lord Bird, and the upcoming miniseries The Gray House. I call her cousin, y'all call her Christy Coleman.
Hey everybody, how are you? I wish we could see you all. Hello, good to see you. Thank you all so much for the invitation to join you today and celebrating Juneteenth. I do want to say that, you know, when Juneteenth became a national holiday, a lot of folks were asking us in the museum and the history sector, well, I mean, why is this so important? And my response to why Juneteenth was so important is none are free until all are free. But what most folks didn't understand about that is that before Juneteenth, before what happened in Texas, there were communities around the country, Black communities around the country that were celebrating Emancipation Day, which, and they had different names and different dates for them. And I just wanted to share some of that with you because once you understand my overall, statement here about none are free until all are free, these celebrations, these emancipation celebrations that took place as early as 1862 into the early 20th century did not really galvanize the way Juneteenth has because of everybody wasn't free yet. And it was recognized at the time. So with all of that understanding, let's start back in 1862. Actually, we could start before then because Black folks have been freedom seekers from the first times they stepped onto these shores, whether it was in Spanish territory in Florida or whether it was in English territory in Virginia or French territory and Spanish territory in Louisiana. The bottom line is enslaved people always sought freedom. They always sought freedom of conscience. They always sought freedom for their bodies and for their families, and to be able to have the fruits of their labor be the fruits of their labor. And so because of that, any opportunity, whether it was because of some governmental action or individual action, but more often than not, the freedom movement has always been in the hands of the oppressed. Always. The freedom movement is in the hands of the oppressed. They might get lucky and have an ally or two, but at the end of the day, that desire has always been there. And so we're going to start this idea of Juneteenth. We're going to actually move up a little bit. And like I said, I mentioned 1862, specifically March of 1862. A law is passed that is forbidding the Army, the U.S. Army. This is the U.S. Army. So the Civil War is in play now, right? The Civil War has started. There's almost been a year of action. And in March of 1862, the U.S. government passes a law that forbids the Army from returning self-emancipated people. Now, this is important because Black folk understood that there was an opportunity anytime the United States troops came through their communities, their cities, there was an opportunity to escape to freedom because they had made this a war for freedom. Now, I want to be clear about that. When the Civil War starts, it is not a war to end slavery. It starts as a war to keep the United States unified. It is Black folk, hear what I'm saying, it is Black folk and their allies who forced Lincoln and others, and as the late, great Lerone Bennett put it, forced them into greatness, forced them to make. Frederick Douglass is in Lincoln's ear in the White House saying, this is your opportunity to cripple the South and to end slavery in this country, which has been an anathema to the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal since 1776. It should not have existed. Right. So that's what Douglass is saying to Lincoln. And so subsequently, Congress, now, mind you, again, Congress only now has, the U.S. Congress, that is, by 1862, only has the remaining states plus 3 slave states, actually 4 slave states, to be honest. So you've got Maryland, Kentucky is still in. You have slavery in parts of Delaware, also at the time, but they are still in the Union, as is Missouri. Right? Missouri actually had folks in both camps, but I digress. So in March of 1862, as the armies are marching south and marching west, Black folks say for themselves, you know what? When the army shows up, we going. And that's what happened right here where I am in Williamsburg, Virginia, not far from us at Fort Monroe, Old Point Comfort. There is a historic place there called Fort Monroe. And in March of 1862, and that's why this law was passed. Remember what I said, it is freedom seekers who change, right? So in March of 1862, 3 Black men who were enslaved to Confederate holders and were being used by the Confederate Army to dig trench works in Hampton Roads in the middle of the night, get a rowboat and cross the Hampton Roads rivers, and they cross over to Fort Monroe. And they at the fort is being commanded by Benjamin Butler. And Benjamin Butler himself is, in fact, a staunch abolitionist. So Baker, Shepherd, and Malloy, remember those names, Baker, Shepherd, and Malloy. These 3 Black men escaped the Confederates where they were being used or conscripted. And this is what the Confederacy did. When you hear folks down there, especially in your part of the world, that try to tell the lie that Black folks were soldiers in the Civil War for the Confederacy, that is a lie. They were enslaved people who were conscripted, meaning their owners gave them to the army for 6 months to support the army with their labors. But anyway, Baker, Malloy, the three black men, they head to Fort Monroe. Butler claims them in a very clever legal move. And the legal move is, since the Confederacy considers these men to be property, then he will seize the property and free them. Lincoln is furious at first, but colleagues in Congress said, wait a minute, hold up. This is important. And so they immediately pass this law in March of 1862, shortly after Baker, Shepard, and Malloy. These three black men make their move to Fort Monroe. Within 6 months, there are 10,000 black folk at Fort Monroe, Virginia. There are 10,000 who have gotten word that if we get to the Union Army, we're going to be free people, right? So that's the first one. So I mentioned March of 62 because what happens next in April of 1862 is Congress takes it a step further. Congress then puts together in 1862 the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act in April of 1862. And what this says is slavery will be ended in the District of Columbia. And this is important. But notice it said the Compensation Act too, right? So in addition to freeing enslaved people, Congress also pays the owner $300 as a cross value for each person that is freed. America has in fact paid reparations for slavery. She just paid them to the owners. So that's my second point. But anyway, so Emancipation Day has been celebrated in the District of Columbia to this day. And their Emancipation Day is in fact April 16th, 1862. By July of 1862, we have the Second Confiscation Act. And the Second Confiscation Act, again, allows the Army, even rather than remember that first law in March said you can't turn them away, or you can't return them to their owner. The Second Confiscation Act that comes out in July of 1862 says you can, if they come to you, consider them, do basically what Butler did. You can confiscate them as property, and then you can free them. So now we've got communities that are being developed, particularly in Tennessee and in parts of Kentucky. And remember, Kentucky is still in the United States, but there are slaves escaping from Kentucky into Tennessee to gain their freedom. So in Tennessee and Kentucky, and this is the connecting point to the Clark family, because Clark family is coming out of slavery out of Tennessee, Chattanooga, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so, so the Emancipation Day in Tennessee and Kentucky is April 8th. You see what I'm saying? We got multiple Emancipation Days that were being celebrated and practiced from the 1860s until about the 1930s, 1940s. And there are a variety of reasons why they didn't continue. Some places did continue, like DC. Then we get to January 1 of 1863. And that's when the Emancipation Proclamation becomes law. Now, I have to back up because September of 1862, states in the Midwest, Missouri, Michigan, Illinois, are celebrating their Emancipation Day as September 22nd, 1862. Why? Because of that because of the Confiscation Act that had been done in July. So now we've got, again, from March of 1862 until January of 1863, we've already now gotten 5 different Emancipation Days that are being celebrated throughout the country. The Midwest, we've got Kentucky and Tennessee. We've got it being celebrated in the District of Columbia. And then we add April 3rd of 1865. And there are communities between Emancipation Proclamation date of January 1 and April 3rd of 1860. There are other communities sometimes just small cities that are having their own emancipation days. And those emancipation days are often tied to when the Army came through. And in the last couple minutes that I have, because I don't want to run over my time, and I want to make sure my cousin has her time, I do want to say that we sometimes as a community, we have disrespected the Emancipation Proclamation and what it did. And I want to personally try to correct that. No, it didn't automatically free everybody. But here's what it did do. In addition to saying that it was freeing those persons who were held by the rebels, being the Confederacy. So any Black person who got that word knew that they were free, and word was passing fast and free. The second thing that the Emancipation Proclamation does is it establishes the United States Colored Troops. It allows for all of these Black men and their families who have escaped slavery to become soldiers, paid soldiers in the United States Army. And this hasn't happened since the Revolutionary War. Okay? So that's the other thing that it does. And needless to say, it also gives us watch night, which in our churches, we have watch night associated with the second coming. But watch night was to see whether or not the Confederacy was actually going to relinquish and return to the United States. When they didn't, at midnight on January 1, this law went into effect. Okay? Freeing all persons enslaved in those rebel states and creating that Black Army that would eventually have over 200,000 Black men who would serve in the United States Army and its Navy. On top of that, 25 to 30% of all enslaved Black people prior to the American Civil War ran off during the war seeking their freedom, finding their freedom before freedom officially came in 1865. Richmond, Virginia, like I said, their Emancipation Day was April 3rd, 1865. That's when Richmond was captured by United States troops. And guess what? United States colored troops were the first to arrive in Richmond to take the city back. This is the Confederate capital. And it was Black men who were soldiers. Most of them who had been formerly enslaved are now the ones taking down the city. In Florida, I don't know whether y'all know it or not, but Florida actually has an Emancipation Day, and it is May 20th. And it is still being recognized in small pockets throughout Florida. But that was the Emancipation Day because that's when the Army came through. And it was celebrated until the early 20th century. Which brings us to how were people celebrating? How do you celebrate freedom? You celebrate it with all of your might. You celebrate it with song, with parade, with firework, with picnic, with family, with friends, with faith communities. All of these are the things that all of these different Emancipation Days had in common. And it was powerful and it was important. So much so that many communities did try to shut them down. The white power structures did try to shut these down. And were fairly successful. Richmond's last Emancipation Day was held in 1912. The last full Black-run Emancipation Day in Kentucky and Tennessee, those also were in the 1920s, in the heart of Jim Crow. The governments were not giving parade permits. They were making laws against gatherings of large people without permits. So they were doing everything they could to prevent this celebration while we're also in the middle of the rise of the lost cause narrative from the Civil War, that the South didn't fight to keep her slaves, that it was all about states' rights and all of the other foolishness that has managed to make its way into American history. So yes, none are free until all are free. So June 19th is important. When Granger shows up in Texas on June 19th of 1865, and those folks on that plantation had not gotten word. They had been completely isolated and deliberately isolated in Texas from this news. None are free until all are free. And therefore, we as a nation appropriately should be celebrating Juneteenth. Thank you.
Keep the books on the shelf this time. Thank you, Ms. Coleman, for that very illustrious, educational, and informative background on Juneteenth. I don't think I've ever heard it so interestingly portrayed, even in all of the textbooks. I don't think I've ever heard it pitched that way. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right, our next speaker is Donielle Alexander Blake, another Eatonville native. Give it up for Miss Donielle. Donielle is the daughter of Wanda Alexander and Edward Droopy Atkins. She's a descendant of the Clark family as well, one of Eatonville's founding families. Donielle grew up on Lyman People Street here in Eatonville and attended Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church. She is a graduate of Edgewater High School, Florida State University, and Old Dominion University, and is currently serving as, let me clear up so I can say this perfectly, Chief of Electrical Engineering at NASA Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. That is a mouthful to be proud of. Donielle enjoys learning about African American history, but most importantly, she loves Eatonville and holds it near and dear to her heart.
Okay, as Dr. Coleman explained the importance of Juneteenth, I'm going to give you a perspective from a child growing up in Eatonville and understanding the storytelling and also the documentation of how Eatonville came to be. So Dr. Coleman talked about Juneteenth and the importance of Juneteenth, and she talked about the Clark family basically being in Tennessee. But one particular thing that had happened along the way was that William Clark and Angelina Clark had gotten, shortly before the Civil War, had gotten either purchased, we know, or relocated back to the N.N. Clark plantation in Covington, Georgia. Now, while that is important, we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in Juneteenth, but one thing that Lincoln had done was he passed Special Order number 15, and that was an order in which they had 400,000 acres of land that had been confiscated by the Confederates that they had planned to redistribute to newly freed Black families. And so what that order allowed for was up to 40 acres and a mule to be redistributed to Black families. With that in mind, that's where we get 40 acres and a mule. So with that in mind, William Clark and Angelina Clark decided to try to get back to Tennessee, as well as that's where most of their family was, to basically obtain the 40 acres, to claim the 40 acres and a new life. And as well as there are also opportunities in Tennessee for better education for the kids or for the children. So they got to Tennessee and then pursuing this land ownership. But what happened was Lincoln was assassinated. And once Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson got into office. And so Andrew Johnson, one of the first things he did, he reversed the Special Order 15, that was the 40 acre and a mule. Okay, and when he did that, that means that land ownership was no longer a possibility for Blacks or newly freed slaves. So William Clark stayed in Tennessee and continued to work hard and raise his family. But unfortunately, at that time, the Ku Klux Klan was on the rise, and there was attempts at, burning Black folks' house, and there was also attempts for the Clark's family in which they also had attempt on their house to be burnt down, and they were able to get away, and so on and so forth. So one of the things he did was he moved back to Georgia with his family. And through that, even though William Clark didn't realize the land ownership that was supposed to be the promise of 40 acres and a mule, he emphasized to his children the importance of education and land ownership. His children were Henry, Mary, Joseph, William, and Isaac. Mary Clark went on to go to Clark College, and William and Joseph Clark helped to construct what we know now is Morris Brown. In fact, their names are on the cornerstone of the original administration building for Morris Brown College. So, of William Clark's kids, they all understood the importance of education and land ownership, but Joe Clark took that to heart. He caught on to to his dad's idea that land ownership was the great equalizer, the great economic equalizer. So Joe set out to own land in hopes not only to own land, but to create an independent, what he called a black colony. Okay. So with that, he set out to make money, save his money to get this land. The problem was he could not find a white owner that would sell him land at that time. So not only did Andrew Johnson basically get rid of the clause for the 40 acres and the mules, he also, under his rule, created what they called the Black Codes. And in those Black Codes, it gave states the ability to put into law that Black people or newly freed slaves could not own land or property. So a lot of whites were not selling land at that time. And so Joe Clark's dream of land ownership and an independent Black time was not realized at the time. So Joe, in the 1870s, moved down to Central Florida. At that time, there was a lot of African Americans or Black moving to Central Florida to hope to find work in the citrus industry. So Joe worked in the citrus industry, and he just so happened to start working for Josiah Clark in the 1870s, okay, the later 1870s. Now, Josiah Eaton, he was a retired Union Navy captain, and he had moved to Maitland. He had bought land in Maitland, and he had some citrus groves there, okay, and Joe worked for him. But Eaton wanted to incorporate Maitland. And as we know, the Black man had the right to vote. And in order to incorporate it, you had to have a certain number of citizens or residents in your city. So Eaton solicited Joe to go into Negro communities to get the residents or the people in those communities to move to Maitland so he can establish Maitland as an incorporated town. So Joe did just that. And so as he circled the community, taking out, basically advertisement in local newsletters and talking to churches and all that good stuff, with that, a lot of Blacks moved to Maitland. And back in 1887, in the 1880s, the Blacks ended up outnumbering the whites. Okay, and so they had their first election in Maitland, and in that election, we were smart back then because we had two Black people that was voted in Maitland to the surprise of Eaton. Tony Taylor was voted as the first mayor of Maitland, and Joe Clark is the first town marshal of Maitland. In fact, on Maitland's charter back in July 17th, 1885, you will see Joe Clark's signature on that town charter. So Joe Clark was the town marshal of Maitland. And as I said, that he basically was law enforcement at that time. And so one of the things, as he tried to do his job, that he was disenfranchised with was that a lot of the whites that came from the north that was there to basically stay for the summer, they basically didn't listen to Joe. So Joe was law enforcement, but the long arm of the law of Joe was limited again because those same Black codes that Andrew Johnson had put in place would not allow for Joe to enforce laws on the white people. He could not arrest them if they were disorderly. In fact, Black people could even serve on a jury with a white person was the defendant. So with that in mind, that made Joe even want to have an independent Black state or colony even more. So Joe presented his idea of an independent Black town to Josiah Eaton, and later on to a philanthropist named Lewis Lawrence out of Utica, New York. Both Eaton and Lawrence supported Joe's idea of having an independent Black town. And so with that, Eaton sold Clark some land, and Lawrence donated land for a church. But not only did they sell him land, they also convinced other white people to sell land to Joe and other black folks so that Eatonville could be established. So once Joe got the land that he purchased on the south side of Maitland, he got to do the work to go out and advertise to basically advertise Eatonville as a place where blacks could be free and independent. And he did the same thing he did marketing for Eaton for himself. So he brought in black folks because he had saw what it took to be incorporated through his experience at Maitland, in Maitland basically. And so he knew that he needed free black men to create a town charter and to establish a town. And so that's what he did. And so he got the residents up and the numbers up, and they established a charter, and they got the man needed to incorporate Eatonville. And so with that, Eatonville was born, and Joe's Clark dream of an independent black colony was finally realized. And you've already heard why we are so interested in Joe Clark is because we are all related or descendants of the Clark family. And many people already know that Joe Clark is the person that basically established Eatonville. And it was the first incorporated town in the United States. There were other black communities, but Eatonville is the first to be incorporated, the first to be documented on paper to have its own self-governance. And it's a remarkable thing that Joe did here because Joe established Eatonville in 1887. He was born in 1859. So when he established Eatonville, he was a young man. He was only 28 years old. Okay. Eatonville, like I said, was a wonderful place. It was its own town. It was where blacks could be free, where we had all rights under the law. As Zora Hurston puts it in Dust Tracks on the Road, I was born in a Negro town. I do not mean by that the black side of an average town. Eatonville is and was at the time of my birth a pure Negro town. Charter, mayor, council, town marshal, and all. It was not the first Negro community in America, but it was the first to be incorporated, the first attempt at organized self-government on the part of Negroes in America. And how did I learn about the history of Joe Clark and different things? It's through the elders in Eatonville growing up and my involvement in the community. I would go to what they call ECC meetings or Eatonville Concerned Citizens meetings with my grandmother, Pauline Alexander. I'm going to reminisce a little bit because I want to talk a little bit about growing up in Eatonville. I would go to these meetings with my grandmother. I was a member of Macedonia, and ECC every summer would have this program to improve your academics. I really hated to go, but my grandmother would make me go, and I would learn things on the history of Eatonville with Miss Ote and Mr. Frank Ote. And we would go out. They showed me how Mr. Calhoun and Miss Calhoun started Hungerford. Hungerford the land was donated mostly by the Hungerfords, but it was also black families like the Brazils and the Mosleys. They also donated a small portion of land for what is the Hungerford Trust now, so that it can be used for the education of black children. So Eatonville was its own place, had its own schools, own grocery store, own gas stations, own restaurants. It wasn't anything that we did not have in Eatonville. In fact, Booker T. Washington, in his book, The Negro in Business in 1899, upholds Eatonville as a model of African-American like entrepreneurship. Eatonville from its inception was a symbolism of empowerment. It was a self-sufficient town, free from outside influences. It was like a black utopia of such. You know, I could hear the stories that my dad would tell, or that, you know, people like Amy Fillmore or my Uncle John or even my Aunt Edis, who's there, and when they went to Hungerford, and if they would win a game, they would go and ring the victory bell, and then they would go to Ward's and have a burger. Those type of things live in me, and that's why history is important, because if not for them passing those things on to me, I would not have known where I came. So I digress a little bit, and I got to bring up one other person, Sam Ware, Deacon Sam Ware. When I was a child, I went to Macedonia, and I had to memorize my books of the Bible, and I would be so frantic every Sunday that morning going. But what it made me have was basically total recall of memory. And as an engineer, I needed that in school because when I was studying to be an engineer, I could commit all of that stuff to memory and have total recall. And that's because Sam Ware made me learn those books of the Bible. So all these little stories that I'm telling you is what makes Eatonville great. You know, running through the streets of Eatonville, we used to have some streets that didn't have trees, some that did have trees. And so we would run and race during the day. And then when we got hot, we go to from Lime Street to People Street. And then we would get underneath the trees where we could find cool and comfort. And everybody knew each other, where Miss Parrish would be across the road and she would press your hair and then teach you etiquette classes. She taught us how to jump rope. My sister Erica can agree on that or whatnot. But it was just a wonderful time to grow up in Eatonville. Eatonville was not all fun and games, like I said, as a child. I had to go up to ECC and learn my books of the Bible. But it taught me about Black excellence. It was expected that for you to go out and do great things. It was expected for you to be a person of principle, you know, a trustworthy person. If nothing else, Eatonville instills those values in you. And then lastly, the thing I want to bring up is that we must know our history so we know where we came from. Eatonville, I believe, is in a renaissance, in a new birth. It's developing in good ways, but at the same time, we want to make sure we solidify our history. Hold on to that. I went up to the Smithsonian African American History Museum. Well, I was surprised that Uncle Joe was not given any credit in the whole establishment of Eatonville. I was honored to see, you know, Josiah Eaton being given credit for the town's name. However, I was a little bit remiss in the fact that Uncle Joe had not been given credit. And that's something that we don't want to continue to happen in Eatonville. So we need to continue to document our history, hold on to our history, and be our own voice. You know, Hungerford gave the land, but like I said, Brazils and Mosleys also contributed too. Oftentimes, as Black people, we have been not recognized in history as being contributors, but we know that we are. It's because this is mostly due to racism and people feeling that we were inferior in the past. But thank God for change. So I just want to talk about legacy and how we need to continue to have a positive legacy in Eatonville and to keep that in mind as we develop and as we continue to have these strong community ties. I think Langston Hughes says, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up in the sun? And I say to that, no. My Uncle Joe's dream was to have a all Black town with independent government. And that dream is realized and his legacy is in Eatonville. So if I had to think about it, what happens to a dream deferred? I would say that it explodes. Eatonville is a culture. Uncle Joe had a dream of independence, but the people that are in Eatonville created a whole culture. We're our own culture based on our ancestors or the people that came before us. So one of the things I want to leave you with is that the spirit of Eatonville is always going out, challenging and making a way for other people. My family legacy is rich. So I'm going to share with you a couple of things about my family legacy. We talked about Joseph Clark establishing Eatonville and constructing Morris Brown. But did many of you know that William Clark, the person that founded Goldsboro, what is now Sanford, that was his brother? Sanford and Eatonville are actually sister cities. And not many people know that. I'm the granddaughter of George Alexander, and he was the first supervisor of Orange County mosquito control. Or it's another fact, my Aunt Carol Alexander in 1947 served as witness for Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall sat in my grandmother's house on People Street. Her deposition turned to the overturning of the conviction of the Groveland Four. And I could go on, you know, my cousin, my aunt, my grandmother, Catherine Alexander, served as postmaster there. The post office is named after her. And you heard Dr. Christy Coleman, that's my cousin. She was the first African American to lead the Civil War Museum. I have a cousin, Catherine. She was the first officer, Black female officer, to serve as a supply and be in command of a supply ship in the USS Villa Gulf. Or my cousin Tina, who was the first Black female athlete to get a scholarship from Indiana. And I could go on and on. My family is not the only one in Eatonville to have this type of history. but we need to know these histories so that we can continue to improve. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with the words of Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou says, history, despite its wretched pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. This is one of my favorite quotes. While we cannot change the past, we can have the courage to change the future. And so by changing the future, we can prevent the suffering that some of our ancestors experienced in the past. Knowledge is power, and educating oneself on history enables us to improve upon the past and increase our chances at a brighter future, as in the case with Joe Clark. Therefore, learning from history is truly a noble cause. In particular, learning Eatonville history is very important. We should use history to inspire others. For a generation which ignores history has no past and no future. That's a quote from Robert Healy. Therefore, we must solidify our past in knowing what it is, make the history certain, and make sure we know the facts and inspire the future so that future generations can improve upon what we've already laid down. So that's all I have to say today. I hope I did a good job. So.
So much to digest, so much pride, so much culture. And I'm just very, very honored that we were able to partner with 1887 Juneteenth, Dr. Candace and Esteemed Learning, the town of Eatonville, and all of you here to bring us together as family to hear families speak about the heritage and the legacy of the town of Eatonville. So at this time, we're going to open the floor for any questions that you may have for Christy or Donielle. And if you do have any questions, let me know. I'll bring the mic over to you. As I said, this is being recorded, so we need for you to speak into the mic so that we can make sure that we get everything.
Christy, when did your love for history start? Because I recall when you were young, you worked at Williams Colonial Williamsburg. So can you share a little of that with us?
Well, I mean, truth be told, it started before then, right? It started with mom and dad, because whenever I had an assignment in school, particularly out of a history class or in my English class, and I had to write a paper on somebody, they would say, well, you should write about so-and-so. Go research that. And it was always about introducing to my classmates and my teachers Black figures that they didn't know anything about. So that's kind of where it started. And what actually took me to the museum world, 'cause I'll tell you, this was not what I thought I was going to be when I was growing up. When you got a family of scientists and engineers and all of that, I that wasn't initially what I thought I was going to do. But we also are a family of creatives. And I don't want that to lie. We got a lot of just amazingly talented people in the family. And so I came into museums actually for theater. I loved theater as much as I loved history, as much as I loved science, but I really loved theater. And so I got a summer job when I was 17 in Colonial Williamsburg doing theater. And basically that theater was researching and portraying the lives of enslaved people. And that was happening at a time when ain't nobody want to see us doing that. So, but once they did, they understood. And so, that's kind of how I came into it. And yeah, you're right. I love American history in particular. And, my areas of expertise do span from colonialism through Reconstruction. I'm not as strong in the 20th century, so, I didn't want to turn things cousin Donielle to talk about. But yeah, that's it too. And talking about memories of being in Eatonville, because we lived in Virginia, and every summer up until I was about 14, our parents used to drop us off in Florida, and so I spent half my time in Winter Park, where my mother's family is, and the other half of my time in Eatonville. And there's a bunch of Alexander, Montgomery's, there's just a bunch of us, right? And so it was always fun, and there was plenty of folks in the age group, whatever age group you were in. And I remember playing on Eatonville when the only paved street in Eatonville was Kennedy. Everything else was sand, and that was cool because you could get out there playing that sand. You had to watch out for the fire ants, but we had a good time out there. We had a good time. It was very different, and it was ours. That's the thing that I just remember the most. It was ours. It wasn't worried about like in Winter Park. My grandparents' house literally was less than a block from the railroad tracks, and if you crossed those railroad tracks, you were in a different world. And folks looked at you different. So all of that is history. All of that is important to me to share. Sorry for the long answer. I'll make them shorter.
So good afternoon, Christy. My name is Barbara Chandler. I'm over in Hannibal Square at the Heritage Center, and that's where I was going. What was the relationship at that time between Hannibal Square and Eatonville? I stood corrected when the other young lady mentioned that Sanford was the direct sister city, because I've been saying Hannibal Square is. So just if you can tell me the correct information on the relationship at that time with Hannibal Square and Eatonville.
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. And I'll be honest, I had not heard of Hannibal Square, but there's a new book that's come out on Black cities and Black communities and their ties to each other. Brand new book. I mean, came out in the last, find my colleague's name, because she and I had an exchange because I was like, girl, you don't have enough in there on Eatonville. And she said, it's in there. But she talks about well over 100 different communities. Sanford's in there, and I do believe that the square is in there too. And I will, before we leave, I will give you the name of the book so that you can. Okay, so I'll quiet down here and find it for you.
Hey cousins, it's Ruth again. My question is actually directed at both of you. Either of you can answer it or both. I know we are all familiar here in the town with the infamous writer Zora Neale Hurston and her stories about the town of Eatonville and her light that has or her books that have shined light on our community and our culture. What is the importance? I know we spoke about documentation earlier as well. What is the importance, especially in today's climate and society, of passing those stories down to the next generations? And how, if at all, can we get into more books? I know, Christy, you are in a very academic field, so how is it that we can get some of our stories and some more narratives and some more of our history into more books, kind of in the manner that Zora did, in an academic way?
I'll start by saying, actually, you'd be surprised that Eatonville's in a number of books. It is in a number of national history books as well. It is it's kind of one of these situations where sometimes in the book Eatonville is kind of placed as, almost like an only Black town, just like Tulsa is placed as the only Black Wall Street or the only place that was bombed. So the good news is that the story of Eatonville is out there, but it is predominantly in the academic community. And we know that most of the public does not have access, not that they don't have access to it, that they don't make access to it. And so that's part of the challenge of getting that word out. By the way, the book is by Jada Wright Green. And her book right now is actually called Florida's Historic African American Homes and Communities.
If I could hop in. So I'm Erica. I'm a former classroom educator, still an educator, but my medium has changed. And so I say I'm a storyteller because whatever it takes to tell the story, that's what I do, whether it be audio or video or photography. Um, Donielle said it. History, despite its wrenching pain, can't be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. So it's very important that we understand the positive and the negative sides, right, of history, so we don't go and make those same mistakes. So we understand how we were disenfranchised and ill-treated in the past, and we can secure in our future a way forward for our children, right, for new generations, but also have them informed. I think a way that you give children history without sitting in a classroom and it being quote unquote boring because the classroom setting isn't for everyone is to engage them in what they do now, have them be a part of the storytelling, have them understand Eatonville and go out and preserve those voices with microphones and documenting, right, create your own archive, and have the town come out and celebrate what those youth have done. I say that because I was a part of programs in Eatonville that did just that. And because of that, me being an educator started at church when I had to educate other students. Understanding, having a deeper understanding in the classroom came because I was sitting in church and I couldn't cut up and they had already taken my gum on the little slip, right? I was in church, but I had to understand when the pastor was talking about parables and he was inferring some things. Those things came quite naturally. So the way forward is in the community. It's not looking out of a window saying, oh, that's how they did it. It's looking in the mirror. It comes from within. We have what we need. We have to organize it, right? Maybe that's on me. Maybe it's time for me to come back for a summer storytelling, something. And that's true. And I take responsibility of that because I don't just wear the shirt, but I too am Eatonville. So I believe, like, yes, you have to read the books. Reading and that foundation is there, that solid rock is there. But then to be innovative and move forward in those ways is something that we not just can do, but we have to do to engage our youth so that they can have those skills to continue to pass it on.
And I'm going to piggyback on that a little bit. I've seen a couple of people in Eville. I think the guy is Julian Johnson or the 1887. I can't remember the, but also some of the stuff they've had there. But we have to document in a way that young people do, whether it's social media or any other type of media for that matter. Just because the tool that they use is different than a book, but I think that they're empowered to do that, but we have to be certain, like I said, that they get correct information and that we're keeping track of it in a way that is healthy for the community. So.
Thank you, Donielle and Erica.
I have a question for Danielle and Erica because they're not only Eatonville tied, but they're Winter Park tied. So what's your name, Miss Chandler? Do you know if where the connection was between Hannibal Square and Eatonville? Do you have an idea?
I don't have a whole lot of ideas, so I'm going to speak a little bit. And unfortunately, my husband is not as good on his history as I am. But uh, his last name is Blake, and his grandmother is Elizabeth Blake, and she actually owned the land in which they built the square in part of Hannibal Square at one time, where they have the community center. So what I've learned from his brothers and through some of his family, the connection with Hannibal Square was that in particular, the school. So Eatonville had Hungerford for certain grade levels, and it's my understanding that they had Hannibal for the lower grade levels, and then also Hannibal, from my understanding, is where they set up some medical care. Thus, that's why the clinic ended up being in Hannibal later on. So, like when my mom was young or my dad was young, you could actually go there and get. They had a doctor that came to Hannibal Square, according to my dad, and they could get, you know, somebody to give them treatment if they needed. So what Eatonville didn't have, Hannibal Square sort of aided them in that measure. But again, as long as they stayed on one side of the track, then they were fine. But Hannibal Square represented that for Eatonville as well, a place to go where they could be educated and seek medical care. And so those are some of the things I do know about Hannibal Square. So
This is a question because I want to make sure I'm understanding the area that you're talking about. Is Hannibal Square the same area that used to be called a square?
Yes.
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 Oh,
They just because they just left off Hannibal.
They went back.
okay.
Over there by Trick and Dick, down the street from Trick and Dick.
Yeah.
Pawn shop, huh?
No comment. Okay. Yeah, that's all been taken over and gentrified the last
Yeah.
time I was in one.
Yeah.
You know, you right there on Swope or Swoop, you go into Mac Hayes right there, you know.
House isn't even there anymore. That whole area.
Yeah.
It used to be public house across the street, and I mean it's all different. It's all very different in the last 20. Been about 20.
I'll say this. A couple years ago, I had a podcast called Belonging. And in that podcast, it was all about, talking about what belonging does for a people, right? Not the black backside of a town, a little section where they let you live, but this is ours and it's incorporated. As a part of that podcast, I interviewed my mother, and she said, when I went to school in Eatonville, she was born in 1954. I don't think she'd be mad that I said that, right? Born in 1954, we know 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, overturned separate but equal. And what happened was, she said, when I went to school in Eatonville, like, I knew my teachers wanted me to learn. That sense of belonging, I knew my teachers, that her teachers embraced her. And then when she went outside of when the schools were integrated, she said she was terrified, right? What I understand Eatonville to be is not just a safe haven, but a place where we belong. Fine, don't get me wrong. Love Hannibal Square, love other towns and all of that great stuff, because we belong there too. We belong everywhere that we are. We belong there, right? But in Eatonville, for me as a child, I'm thinking, well, I did feel like I belonged. I knew people, right? Because I don't live in Eatonville and haven't been back in the town to live for a very long time, right? That sense of belonging, I do feel through this setting. Like, I can't see your faces, but I know I belong in this space. And I know that everybody in that room is willing and able to create a continued sense of belonging when it comes to the youth, the history of the town, and moving forward. So that was on my heart. I just wanted to share.
Yes.
I just want to add a comment. It's not really a question. Comment, I guess. I just want you to know that there are people in Eatonville who lived in Warner Park, who attended Warner Park Elementary School and Eatonville Elementary School and Hungerford. So those kids were mostly bused from one area to the other. So there is a connection between the two, because everybody black in Warner Park had to go to Hungerford in order to get an education, a high school education. So the connection, the families are connected, and so there's still quite a few of us around.
Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie.
Good afternoon. I can't let this go by. I'm looking at two sisters that I've watched grow up, and I always call them two old souls. Two old souls when they were little kids in our recreational program. And I want just you to know in a comment that I am so proud of y'all. And every time y'all used to come home, y'all would come right by my house. Hey, Mr. Eddie Cole, and tell me what you're doing. I'm proud of y'all. I hope y'all get together and create that book that's the true organic story of Eatonville. We have too many window shoppers coming in saying what Eatonville is, and that's not what Eatonville. And I can say that being here 40 years now. The organic part of Eatonville needs to come back from your family. So Clark family, I'm ready for the book.
It's funny that you said that. I was talking to Donielle today, and I said, I don't know what faith everybody's a part of, but I grew up in the church. In due season shall a tree bring forth its fruit. You can keep on watering, but until the season comes, And I'm a former classroom teacher. I do believe that the season is now for me to come home and gather the stories and tell those stories. I almost this morning held my head down in shame, and Danielle reminded me to pick it up through her words. I'm like, my cousin is Christy Coleman. I'm not at a loss for history, and I know all the folks in the community. I have the tools. And so as soon as possible, I'm coming back to tell those stories, to gather those stories. One of the things I do believe is that you get the okay from the elders. You don't just walk into a space and feel like you're entitled. I know I belong there, but I want the blessing and permission. So it shall start soon.
And one last thing I want to say, growing up in Eatonville, what it taught me is that it taught me confidence. Now, can't tell. I was a little nervous talking because I'm around people that I want to always put my best foot forward. But I can go into, I happen to work for NASA now, but I can go into a room full of, all white men and talk about reactants and power and the nuclear fission process, no problem. But when you are in front of people that that love you, you always want to do a good job. So I was very nervous in doing that. But what Eatonville gave me was confidence. I don't think if I lived anywhere else that I would have become an engineer. Over the years, I've had some success in being an engineer, but I wouldn't be where I am if it had not been the village that was Eatonville. It gave me the courage. It gave me the support that I needed to continue. I'm chief of electrical engineering at NASA here. I've been federal project director. I've been a lot of different roles, but I'm not timid in those roles, and that's because of Eatonville and the legacy that was put in me to always hold my head up. I go and talk to my auntie Liz sometime, which is Christy's mom, or whatnot, and I enjoy her telling me the stories of when she went to Hungerford and the expectation that she told me, you always carried yourself a certain way. Because even if you were at a point where you were nervous or you were going through something, she says you never let it show. And she says she learned that at Hungerford. And she says she don't understand the young people that don't do that, right? But that's how when you go, she says, when you go into a room, you present yourself as royalty every time. They don't have to know that you are not. But and through that, I learned to understand what it is to be an Eatonvillian, to have that culture in you. So I just wanted to pass that on to say, Eatonville, keep doing what you're doing because the products are there. We just have to keep watering and nourishing it. So.
I'm not a question, but for Christy, I call Christy the historian. I just want to let you know that my grandson just graduated from Edgewater, and he wants to be a history teacher, professor, preferably. He loves history, and so he wants, especially Eatonville history, and that's what he wants to do. He wants to do history. He wants to be a history professor.
Make sure he can read cursive. You can't get good scholarship if you can't go through those old records and be able to read that material.
Yeah, yeah.
But outside of that, he's great. He's gonna be doing.
And they don't teach that.
Yeah.
Cursive. They don't even teach that anymore.
I mean, this is the one where he's gonna have to. Y'all gonna have to help him. I mean, that's one of the. I know because my two. I have an 18 and a 21-year-old, and I have all these notes, and they look at me, and I write them little notes around the house, and they look at me like, "What is that, Mom? What is? I don't know what that is. What does that say?" That's definitely something, But the love of a subject, that's the thing about being a historian, is that you get to lock in on a particular element that you really like. You got to have a general knowledge, certainly, but as you continuing down the path and doing your work and doing your own, doing your research and putting forth your own theories or whatever, you absolutely have the opportunity to lock in and dig deep into a subject that others haven't looked at before. You know, that's all. But just, you know, get that undergraduate, take those history classes, see how it's doing, goes off to, you know, get his master's. And there are a couple of programs around the country where he can do his master's and doctorate at the same time in 4 years, which saves a lot of money. Just have time to, you know, work on that dissertation. But yeah, there's a way to do it. And you know, history educators are needed desperately. And I will tell you, there are other options in addition to being a history professor. There are historians are actually in the State Department. There are tons of jobs for historians in the State Department, where understanding the histories and cultures of communities around the world or periods of time are invaluable. And most folks don't even know that. I think part of the problem is that government doesn't use them the way they could and should or as often, or at least, you know, the political leadership, even if the State Department and their networks are, intelligence networks are, there are lots of ways to do it, and to have an impact if you love history. Not to mention the museum world. Half of all museums in the country are history museums. So.
Thanks, Christy.
You're more than welcome.
No, I did have questions. I just didn't want to interrupt her while she was talking. Okay, sorry about that.
Hi, Christy and yes, Erica. So, can they hear me? Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, so I have a question. As you guys were talking about historians, one of the challenges that I'm constantly finding is finding websites with a list of books or just books in general for elementary level kids that would be good in regards to Black history that are not necessarily, just for lack of better words, overly traumatizing, but yet, you know, still positive and appropriate for elementary level kids. So do you guys have any suggestions for websites that would have a list for African American kids? I would also, of course, like to have predominantly African American authors as well.
I don't have a list like right now, but I will, if your information could be forwarded to me, I will do my research and figure it out, because I know this is a difficult area. I know a curriculum writer who is looking for more books, and it's definitely hard to find. There's a couple, and you also, like you said, want those books to be by people who understand and not just from the perspective of folks who don't look like you or think like you, or, you know, so it's hard. But if your information could be forwarded to me, not verbally, because I'm not going to remember that, but if y'all can if you could send me an email, I would love to continue, because this is something I've been trying to do myself, to compile a library of books that we can pull from, and particularly in history. I would love to do that for you, or with you. Let's work together.
I'm going to give you 3 sources that you can go to. The first source is, frankly, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History. When you go onto their website, their link, okay, and you go over for educators, there's a tab for educators. And you click on that and you choose, they have curriculum, they have books that are age appropriate depending on the levels for kids. It's a powerful, powerful tool. A lot of museums do that, have these links to educator materials. And that educator material, whether it's homeschooling or what have you, is really quite powerful and often represent the work of Black scholars and Black writers. The other source is going to be actually the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation. And it's simply, I think it's simply GLI. It's yale.edu/GLI for the Gilder Lehrman Institute. There is, I'm telling you, there is, in my view, none better in terms of resource materials than that Yale program. And then the last one that I would recommend is actually the Zen, the Howard Zen web page, which also Howard Zen was a transformative educator who believed that we shouldn't be lying to our children. And he started this movement back in the 70s. White guy, Jewish, but let me tell you, the materials that have been compiled by a variety of peoples about their history in America, they don't get much better than the Zen Center. So check that out. Those are the three that come to mind. But top of the list is definitely the African American Museum at the Smithsonian. Again, the second one is the yale.edu/GLI. And I don't remember the Zen one off the top of my head. It's probably zinn.edu or .com, something, or not .com, .org is another source where they have bibliographies, they have study guides, they have all three of these sites also have it's just a wealth of information and material. So start there. That's where you will find what you need, along with lesson plans. If you're an educator in the classroom, you can get lesson plans there too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, family. This is Baruti speaking. How you ladies doing?
Good.
I just wanted to add, your cousin Antoinette has a site called Black and Bookish, and that's where she focuses on providing those type of materials as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Black and Bookish?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Nice. Thank you. Making a note of it.
Okay, well, that will end today's program. Before I let you all go, we do have refreshments and drinks over here in the room. Thank you, Mr. Baruti, for providing those. You're also in a library, and you're in a library that we have been very intentional about highlighting African American resources. Since I started here in 2020, I've been very intentional about making sure that the residents of Eatonville know that this is their home library. So when you come into our library, you are at home. The resources are for all of our Orange County residents, but they're specifically, especially for you. We have a collection in the back that's called our African American History and Culture Collection. Please check that out. We also have amazing displays. We have a Juneteenth display that's up now. It's also highlighting the other events that we have for the rest of this week here at the library. On Saturday, we will be partnering with the Boys and Girls Club, and we're having a talent expo. It's called the Kumba Storytelling Expo for children. So please bring your little ones out. It starts at 1 p.m. It will be at the Boys and Girls Club, and they'll be doing stories, reenactments, all that tie in with Black history, historians, and African folklore. The town of Eatonville also has a slew of other events going on. I think you can find them on 1887 Juneteenth website. So make sure you check that out as well. Please, if this is your first time coming to this library since I've been the manager, please don't leave out before you take the time to go and look around and see your amazing library that we have specifically curated for the residents of Eatonville. So please make sure that this is not your first time visiting us. Come in, check out the collections. We have everything for everyone. When this library first started, it was a children's library. Now, this is a family library. So we have classes, we have programs, we have art exhibits, we have amazing displays, and we have a team of staff here that love the people, and we just like to be engaged, and we're proud to be in this community. We represent the town of Eatonville proudly, and we're glad to be able to partner with the town. Like I said, Esteemed Learning, 1887, the town of Eatonville, to put on this amazing, let's give this has been like, this program, we do great programming here, if I must pat myself on my back. But this program, thank you so much, Dr. Candace, for bringing this idea to us, this collaboration. Thank you, Ruthie, for stepping in to helping to co-host with us today. I learned so much about the history of the town of Eatonville, and we learned it from the people who have lived it. So thank you all for being with us today. Please come back to visit